Okay, welcome everyone. Today's topic is biased AIs and the problems of biased AIs and how we might overcome them and make AI better in our businesses. And to help me untangle this topic, I am joined today by Ted Kwartler, who is the VP of Trusted AI at DataRobot. Welcome, Ted.
Thanks for having me.
Such a pleasure. So where are you joining us from today?
I'm actually outside of Boston, so in the US.
Very
DataRobot
good.
headquartered in Boston, so that's where I'm at.
Very good. So tell us a little bit more about yourself and what you do for DataRobot and what does it entail to be a VP of Trusted AI?
Yeah, that's it's an unusual title, I admit. So in total, it's about 25 people on the team. This includes engineers, product managers, AI ethicists, and we even get involved in some government relations work. So we build functionality in our app where we are trying to, let's say, identify and give our users insights into model bias or help them with documentation in regulated environments. So that's on the engineering side. When we have customers or prospects with sensitive use cases, we'll embed our AI ethicists to help them with that. And then on the government relations side, sometimes we have to meet with staffers or the occasional legislator to help them as they're trying to craft different proposals around it. So it's really a multidimensional problem.
Absolutely. So how big is the problem of biased AIs and where are we today? How widespread is it? And why does it matter to businesses? What's the business impact of biased AIs?
Yeah, it's a great question. To be honest, I think that it's a fairly large problem. The AI partnership has created the AI incident database. You can check online. And last I checked, there was 13 or 1400 public missteps caught in the media around models that are misbehaving in one form or another. Poor recommendation engines on the content side, scheduling your low wage workers and taking advantage of them, where these models are extrapolating out. In credit, sometimes you see credit models that might be biased towards women, for instance, and these are all captured. The reason I think it's actually a pretty big problem is no company wants to admit to that, to these missteps. And if the AI incident database is catching 1,400, that means there's a lot that are transparent that we don't know about, or the organizations are trying to mitigate those risks. So I do think that it's a pretty large problem. In terms of like the business impact, in regulated industries, it's pretty large, right? Because each of these missteps can result in fines. On the other hand, there's also an impact to reputational risk and brand risk. So there's kind of two competing tracks to why a business should care. One is regulations and the stick of government, fines, and on the other, there's the carrot of wanting to attract consumers and customers that and retain them. So I think that that's kind of why companies are motivated about putting these type of models into production in a thoughtful way.
Very good. So what are your favorite examples that illustrate that AIs might be biased?
Yeah, absolutely. So I teach a little bit at the Harvard Extension School, and we have a lesson plan around AI ethics. Some of the ones we cover are around resume scanning. When you have a resume scanning tool, and historically you've hired, let's say, males for certain types of roles or females for certain types of roles, very technologically focused and forward-thinking companies will say, "Great, we want to create a document scanning tool to help us with this influx of resumes. But we know we don't want to have gender, let's say." So they'll remove gender from the model, but then the model still picks up on it. So that's kind of the classic one. I come from an insurance background, so there was a lot of discussion and thoughtfulness around the models from socioeconomic impact on insurance. So I'll cover that as well. So those are probably the two favorite that I usually go to.
So how does it happen? How do we get biased AIs?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of ways to get there. I would say most often what I'm seeing is not a data scientist in the community saying I'm going to set out and build one of these models to misbehave and take advantage. In fact, if you look at Compass, which was used in the United States around sentencing for convicted felons, or you look at there was an algorithm during the pandemic in the UK to help predict standardized test scores. Those actually come from a good place. Where
Mm.
you end up is not ideal. And I think where that comes from is data scientists often got into the game because they like to model, because they like to do the puzzle building and tweak the model. They get very myopic for that model. But when you actually put a model into production, it's a multidimensional problem. And so I think we get there because we don't have the right stakeholders attached to a project when you're building these types of things. One of the things our ethicists will do when they're embedded with clients, one of the first things they do is a stakeholder impact assessment. Just like you would have an environmental stakeholder impact, an environmental impact assessment if you're building a factory, you want to do the same for very sensitive use cases. Helps you frame your thinking around who's most vulnerable in this scenario when we put this model in production, and then how do you mitigate that risk against it.
And I guess there are different levels of bias. You can have bias in the model itself. You can have bias in the data that you're using to train the model.
Absolutely.
Um, where do you see the main problems?
Uh, I've seen a lot in the data side.
Mhm.
So again, uh, I come from a call center background doing analytics there, and we would take the customer satisfaction surveys, and we'd say, "Oh, this is what's wrong with our business," and because this is the data of the customer satisfaction surveys, we'd make a model. In the end, there's a selection bias. Who's taking these customer surveys? Well, the people who are really happy or the people who are really mad, right? And so any data issues start flowing through, and when you put them all in production, that flow through, that garbage in, garbage out remains true. And it's been around for 15 years. And the same is true in bias. When you're oversampling or undersampling a population, if you don't understand how to that could be the case,
Mm.
then your model will just identify a certain pattern and find proxy features and so on, and kind of exaggerate the historical pattern of maybe underrepresented groups.
So you talked about the having AI ethicists on the project team. Is this something you would recommend companies have in place? Because from my own experience, there's some that do this, but the vast majority don't have that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's actually very tough. It's hard to get good data scientists. We know that retention in the industry is hard. On top of it, an AI ethicist. I would be honest when I say that's kind of a mixed bag because sometimes you get people that, for professional branding, say they're an AI ethicist, but have never coded or never put a model in production. And that's not to say they don't have something to contribute to the dialogue. It's to say that if they're embedded with a project team, they're not going to quite understand all the nuances. So what I would say instead is think about educating your data scientists about what responsible AI looks like
Mm.
and how your organizational values are to be embedded either in the model itself or around like the guardrails of the model. That I think is probably easier than trying to add additional headcount or trying to find the unicorn of a data scientist who codes that also has an ethics or psychology background.
Yeah, and I would love to go in more detail to explore what you feel makes a good unbiased AI. But before we do this, what makes a good AI ethicist then? What are their skills and where do we find them?
Ooh. I can speak about my team. I'm real proud of them. They actually will. I think they have a curious nature foundationally. They have a coding background, either ML engineer or a pure data scientist, and ideally would have worked on something that had unintended consequences. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as a resume scanning tool that was gender biased, but something that they realized how projects in themselves, in isolation, ML projects are difficult to get into production. So they understand a different perspective. Um, they understand how these projects can be derailed. And then they come from a perspective of more collaboration and mitigation versus what I call that adversarial type of ethics, where they're trying to get an organization and be shocking. And what I prefer is more of the collaborative effort. And so those are the types of AI ethicists that we have here, where they're trying to find a path forward, identifying the risks, and not explicitly saying this is good or bad for your organization, but here are the risks. And it's up to you in the organization to identify, does this align to our values? Is this something we really want to do? One of the first questions we ask is, why are you using machine learning in this use case? And you would think as a machine learning company, like you wouldn't want to ask that, right? But we want to make sure that this use case fits with what you're trying to do.
Very good. So what does good AI look like, and are there ways to detect bias to be sure you're moving into the right direction?
Yeah, I think good machine learning problems really focus on kind of what I call four personas, and you engender trust in all four personas. One is the AI innovator. This is the line of business leader or the executive who understands their business and conceptually understands machine learning. They probably don't code, but they probably read on the Wall Street Journal. They said, "Hey, I think that machine learning could impact my business in these specific areas." Those are the innovators, right? Next I would say is the AI creator. An AI creator is really the ML engineer and the data scientist. They're in there doing Bayesian parameter tuning. They're checking all the all the KPIs and trying to really grab that data and munge it and then build that model. And at that point, they should be working with the innovator to understand how things can go awry and how to measure bias, right? And bias, it can be measured mathematically. And then once they feel comfortable and that modeling object is done, passing that to another persona, the AI implementer. This is someone who is sitting in IT. It fits within our tech stack. I once had a data scientist colleague at a different company tell me, "Oh, I don't care what happens to my model after I build it. I throw it over the fence to IT." Right? Those would be the implementers. And of course, the implementers hated that, and those models never made it into production. Um, and then finally, there's the AI consumer. In regulated industries, your legal, your compliance, your model risk management, those would be the consumers. In addition to, if you're in a call center environment, it would be the call center agent who maybe gets a customer propensity score for a cross sell or upsell. Or it could be a consumer actually, I was rejected for a loan, and I'm consuming that rejection from that model. So all four of these personas, the innovators and creators, implementers and consumers, all four of them understand trust in that complex system much differently. And you can't just say, "Hey, AI innovator who has no coding skills, I'm going to be fully transparent and here's my Python code." They're not going to know what they're looking at, right? So you have to help them understand the risks associated with their business. Same for the consumer. If I get rejected from a loan and you tell me you were rejected and here's the code, or here's the Tweety deviance for the model, it doesn't help me individually, right? And so good AI addresses trust across all four of those personas. That's what I would say should be the ideal state. The analog I use is if I get onto an airplane and there's smoke in the fuselage and there's wires hanging down and they're sparking, I don't feel comfortable in that complex system, that in the airworthiness of that aircraft, because my perception of what's happening is not that this doesn't seem safe. You contrast that with the pilot. She's sitting in the cockpit. She has her checklist. She's looking at gauges. She's assessing the airworthiness of that complex system much differently than myself, right? And so that's why I think good AI is this kind of multidimensional effort across those four personas. And when we work with clients, we try and identify those personas and say, and articulate risks to each one of those personas a little bit differently so they can earn trust.
Very good. So whose role is it then to create those connections? Because in a number of organizations that I have worked with, where we created data strategies, we created new roles, sometimes called data translators, or people that sit between the data science function and the business function to do exactly that, to build those links and create the communication channels and translate across. Is this something you're seeing?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I was at a large insurance carrier, and they put this effort into product managers because they saw this as a software build, and they wanted to be very traditionally agile. So they would have a product manager helping articulate to each one of these and ensuring the overall movement of the project. I've also seen dedicated people that do this. And at DataRobot, from a consultative perspective, we're kind of a high touch like white glove service. So yeah, you buy the software. We don't just hand it to you and walk away. We have customer facing data scientists who help, who have worked across a lot of industries. We also have AI success managers. And they're a lot of more former management consultants trying to build these bridges and articulate to these different personas.
Very good. I've heard you talk about the fact that AI should be humble.
Sure.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, humble AI, what I would say is the fundamental difference between reality and the way machine learning algorithm understands a phenomena is that reality is deterministic, right? You're either rejected for a loan or you're accepted for a loan. It's a deterministic outcome. But the algorithm understands it on a probabilistic spectrum. It says between 0.01 all the way to 0.99, here's your probability of paying back your loan. So an algorithm will come back with probability, and it says, hey, Bernard's at 0.48 probability, and Ted is at 0.51 probability. And in the end, let's say in that scenario, algorithmically very similar, and the algorithm has understood the phenomena to know that we are similar. But in the end, for the bank, it's a deterministic outcome. You're rejected, I'm accepted. And so because of that, what I advocate for is really a region of uncertainty where the model says, I'm very certain at 0.8 and above and 0 to 0.2 in this example. And that's region of uncertainty in the middle. Maybe you still want to either bring in new data, have a human in the loop for certain use cases, right? And that's what I mean by humble AI. Don't make it a deterministic outcome when you have this region of uncertainty. Oh, I think you're on mute, Bernard.
I am indeed. Whenever we talk about biased AIs or AIs that are not functioning as well, regulation comes in, and what the idea that we need more regulation. And I think at the moment there's the perception across many tech companies that there's some self-governance, self-regulation happening. Most regulators are lagging so far behind what is happening on the ground. In your AI bias report, you make the case that we need government regulation in all of this to look at biased AIs. What are your views on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. We were actually surprised by that. You wouldn't expect a survey of a bunch of business leaders, and I think it was somewhere around 80%, 75% saying that AI regulation would be a welcome. What I actually think is that thoughtful regulation will clear up a lot of ambiguity and allow people to move forward. Like, let's be honest, machine learning AI has the ability to help us. It's going to be one of the tools that help us fight climate change. It's going to be one of the tools that helps us with food security. It's going to be one of the tools that help us with supply chain, right? These are known things that we know that these types of software can actually help us with. But on the other hand, if you're in an environment where there's ambiguity, the reward and risk might not be worth it for you to pursue some of these things. And so I think thoughtful regulation around defining high-risk use cases and defining what documentation is necessary, I think that's important. I also don't think every machine learning algorithm needs to be highly regulated, right? There are quotes out there from some leaders saying we need a full moratorium on machine learning and AI until we understand its impact to human rights. That is tough to put the cat back in the bag, right? But I think a perspective around high-risk use cases, surveillance, education recommendations, obviously credit, employment, these types of high-risk use cases, or high-impact use cases, it can be done if it's done in a thoughtful manner and a planned out manner. Um, but I think those are where we start. And what will happen is new use cases will crop up, and regulators will have to have a means to which they can add or adjust those defined use cases. And I would prefer that to happen through a regulatory body as opposed to yet another separate law, because that lag time is so long, right? So I think there's some thoughtfulness, and I see that particularly around the UK, EU. Singapore Monetary Authority has some of this, and I suspect that somewhere coming out of EU or UK, just like GDPR set the global standard, I think similar will happen for on that happened in the privacy. It'll happen again for machine learning, kind of out of the same region.
You mentioned a few different geographic areas with different cultures. So are there variations in the way different cultures are using AI and applying things like bias detection models?
Yeah, there certainly is kind of a different use of technology and a different, more around AI maturity, right? In other parts of the world, there's you have to be pretty mature in terms of putting models into production to then also have the forethought and the sophistication to say, boy, this is not going well, or this is not behaving as expected. We need to look at cross-class disparity and understand its impact to gender or something like that. So there are differences. I wouldn't say necessarily culturally. I would say more on the AI maturity kind of cycle. Is it their first model they're putting in production? Is their 200th model putting in production? Just yesterday, I was speaking with a large content provider. They have 200 plus models in production, and their goal is to say we want to have documentation for all of them. Because what they realized is, as they went through this over the last 5-10 years, one department puts a model in production, maybe they didn't even evaluate it for this. Another model gets into production on their finance side, and it has full documentation. And they're trying to get out of this Wild West scenario and try and have a unified structure. That takes a lot of maturity to do, though. So I do see some differences culturally in terms of what's appropriate, but more so on the organization and the maturity side of things.
Interesting. Do you think we'll ever get to a point where we have something like a worldwide regulation around AI, or do you feel that we'll have lots of different regulatory rules in different countries?
It's a good question. I'm generally a cynic, if I'm being honest, Bernard. So I actually don't think we're going to get to a worldwide, maybe a set of a framework, like NIST has a framework, World Economic Forum has a framework, maybe a framework, but from a regulatory and fine standard, I doubt that we'll ever get there. To be quite candid.
So if there are lots of people listening thinking, okay, I want to use AI. How do I make this not biased? How do I avoid some of the challenges you've outlined? So what would be your top tips for any business that wants to create unbiased, good AIs?
It's a great question. And this kind of flips it on people's heads. Many organizations believe that unawareness is fairness, meaning, oh, I don't have gender in my model, so it must be fine, right? And that's actually not the case. Unawareness does not mean fairness. So challenge the organization to give the data scientists and the AI innovators who are crafting this modeling project and what the expected ROI is, give them access to some protected features. And if you can't get protected features, try and get directionally accurate. So here in the US, you can get some zip code through census. You can get some probabilistic measure of race in a geographic location. If you can get that level of, you can at least get some directional understanding of, is your model going to be biased? And you can start measuring it. Ideal state would be you have a column, you don't use it for modeling, but you'd say, here's a column of gender, here's a column of race for these different, let's say, customer attributes. Once you have that, you can measure cross-class disparity. And in fact, this is not to be put into production. You can decide to predict upon those. So you take your data and you predict on the gender column And then you'll know what the model thinks is important for gender. And that helps you identify if you have bias in your data and you have proxy information
Mm,
in your data, right? So if you, in the case of resume scanning, if I have a resume that says football, like American football or field hockey, just as words in my document scanning, well, American football is primarily played by males and field hockey is often played by females. So even though I don't have gender, that'll be a proxy for
mm.
gender in my model. And I'm blind to that unless I try and predict gender and then I see those words pop up, right? And so that helps you with that dialogue. So that's on like the practical aspects of the actual model build. Try and get access to some of these protected features so you can get comfortable with it. From the other personas on the implementers side of things, I would say think about runtime assertions. If this thing is happening in my model, what should be done? Do I still make a prediction? So it's all about having careful ML ops and having some forethought when you put a model in production. Don't just let it run in the wild. Things change, recessions happen, pandemics happen, consumer behavior changes, right? And one of those changes could also be, hey, we thought our model was fine, but as now we want to create a feedback loop and understand, maybe over time it starts to have poor accuracy, let's say, or starts to be discriminatory. Having monitors and these runtime assertions within an ML ops capability is super. So those are the two things I would focus on.
Very good. And in terms of more cultural or even skills perspective, we touched on having those job roles in place. Anything else that you think is really important?
Yeah, I do think education is important. And I'm a big fan of when you can and when it's appropriate, helping the consumer of the AI, which is often the person to which it's transparent, helping them understand how they got there, right? You think about your news feed. Your news feed is curated through an algorithm, right? And if the news feed is incentivized to do nothing more than keep your eyeballs there to sell you more ads, you're oftentimes not going to be exposed to things that really enrich your life or give you a new perspective, right? You get
Mm,
into this kind of echo chamber. So thinking about that consumer and helping them a prediction explanation, right? I get rejected from a loan in the United States. They have to provide me access to my credit report, and then I know why I was rejected and contextualizing that. I think
mm,
that's important. Um, Too often these algorithms are very transparent, right? There's an algorithm that feeds what dating profiles you swipe left or right on, right? So even your partner, your news, the music you listen to, right? All of these things are given to you through an algorithm, and the consumer doesn't know that. And to say like, oh, here, consumer, here's the AUC for the model, it's bogus. It doesn't help, right?
mm.
So contextualizing at the inference to the individual, I think helps everyone engender trust and feel more comfortable, and then giving them a grievance process. If I feel that I've actually been unjustly denied, now I have my credit report, I can go back and have a discussion. And the AI Act in the EU talks about a grievance process in some of these use cases. I think that's a very useful tactic when possible.
I in the past, when we applied complex machine learning algorithms like deep learning, for example, the challenge was that they were seen as black boxes. They're saying we can't actually understand how these machines make the decisions because they're too complex. How far away do you think we are from truly explainable AI, especially when it comes to complex models like deep learning?
Yeah, I think that we do a fairly good job at the model diagnostic, which I'd say the high level, here's the model behavior, and then at the prediction and inference level, I think there's room to be improved there. Like, what does individual fairness look like? And that's a hard question mathematically to answer, right? But what I would challenge the notion that you need to know and be fully transparent. I like explainability, absolutely. But if I'm interviewing for a job, they don't ask for my CT scan of my brain and say, there's the synapse that I know that this is going to happen, right? Instead, they ask behavioral questions. And I think in this modeling workflow, the ability to stress test and interrogate a model. So start perturbing some of your data and then putting it back through the model and understanding how predictions change. Just like the analog of an interview, I think that's more appropriate for you to start feeling comfortable with these models. We don't, we very rarely see that happening, right? Where people are starting to interrogate models. It's usually a data scientist, and they'll do a code quality audit with another data scientist, right? Or the AI implementer who says, I'm going to monitor that we don't have data drift, and it gets past a certain threshold, then we'll re-trigger and do some continuous learning. Instead, I'd like to see in that modeling workflow a dedicated ability to interrogate a model, perturbing data, put it back in, seeing where you might find a cohort of the data where it extrapolates out and does something truly bizarre.
Very good. So what are your, if you look into the future, what are your hopes and predictions for the future of AI?
Yeah, I have a colleague, Lisa. She believes that we are on hitting kind of a rough patch. There was a lot of let's get as many data scientists as possible. They'll create a lot of value, and organizations realize there's still a lot more that needs to be done. You don't just set up an academic team of 10 data scientists at $2 million and they create value. They're sitting within an ecosystem. I think standardization of a tech stack and getting models into production, organizations that are mature and are on that maturity journey, they'll figure that out. That will improve our velocity and realized value. So I think that is something I'm hopeful for the future. I think AI regulations, again, very thoughtful regulations, will help clear up ambiguity, and organizations will make the determination, hey, these high-risk use cases, we don't want to do it at all. Even though we could, we don't want to, right? Organizational values. I think that is going to be important. And the ideal state for me is that, fast forward 5-10 years, machine learning is one of these tools, like I said, that helps us solve some of the biggest problems that we have facing us. Here in the US, I mean, the summer's been brutal. August was a miserably hot time. You have droughts and things like that. And how can we be more efficient? Well, this technology helps us find patterns for efficiency and to solve certain problems. We have a client, they're a cement manufacturer, just in one plant, helping them get 1% more efficient using a very complex model on their machine, on their production line, help them save like 70,000 tons of CO2, right? And so like these are tools that have such tremendous benefit. That's where I hope and believe that we'll get to eventually.
Very good. That's a lovely spot to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Ted, for your time today.
Yeah, absolutely, Bernard. I really appreciate the time. It's been great talking to you.
Good. Anyone who ever wants to re-listen to this conversation or any of my other conversations with hundreds of people looking at the future of tech and business, head to my YouTube channel. Thank you very much.